Hi everyone, welcome to Grimmleighs. I'm Leigh. I'll be acting as your storyteller, illustrator, and host for this upcoming episode. If this is our first introduction, it's great to meet you. Each and every week we'll be exploring mythology, monsters, and myth through original stories and illustrations. If that sounds like your cup of tea, please consider scaring up that like button and letting us haunt you forever by subscribing to the channel. Now imagine this, you're 18 years old, you're hanging out with your friends, and just for fun, the group of you decide that you're going to tell some scary stories. Now just think of yourself honestly as you were at that age, or as you are at that age, if that's the case. Is your story good? Is your story going to be transformative? Is your story going to be so amazing that it literally changes the world and perhaps even ushers in a new type of fiction? Mary Shelley did exactly that when she wrote Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. She was 18 years old when she wrote that book. When I was 18, I got drunk on peppermint schnapps and fell out of a tree. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born on August 30th, 1797 to feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft and philosophical anarchist William Godwin. Her parents were widely regarded in philosophical circles, but Papa Godwin was pretty much always in debt. To make matters much worse, Mama Wollstonecraft died suddenly after baby Mary was born because the medical practices at the time were freaking disgusting, and hand washing wasn't really a thing yet. Oh, and don't get too comfortable. This story has so much death in it. I mean, we're talking like a Tarantino-level death count, but without the foot kink and questionable slurs. Little Mary Godwin grew up surrounded by some of the biggest thinkers of the era, being as her dad was something of a big deal in the post-Enlightenment philosophy scene. Her mom was also a legend, so Mary got to see some of the biggest thinkers of the time up close and personal. Her education was informal but not lacking in any way. Her father had a huge library, and she spent most of her youth in that library or in the nearby cemetery reading on her mother's grave. The biggest issue facing Mary while she was growing up was her dad's constant debt. His influence kept them out of trouble for the most part because admirers of his philosophical work kept giving him money to keep him out of trouble and out of the poorhouse. One of those fans was a gentleman named Percy Bysshe Shelley, a dashing poet of some standing in British circles. Percy's father was wealthy at least, and that meant Percy could live pretty well on his charm and an allowance that daddy's money afforded him. Percy Shelley was a big-time fanboy of both of Mary's parents and spent a lot of time talking philosophy with Papa Godwin and eventually promised to take care of Godwin's debts. Shelley also grappled with delusions and hallucinations through most of his life and had been expelled from Oxford for being a noted atheist. His atheism was so problematic for Shelley, well, problematic in the sense that he wouldn't shut up about it, that it plagued him throughout his life. He even lost custody of the children from his first marriage because the judge couldn't abide by children being raised by an atheist. But again, Shelley wouldn't stop screaming about it. He would even sign into lodges, Percy Shelley, I am an atheist. Regardless, fanboy Shelley spent a lot of time at the Godwin estate, and after promising William Godwin that he would help him with his debts, it turns out that he wasn't able to do that. His atheism and his flamboyance about that caused his father to cut him off financially. He lost his allowance, and Papa Godwin was pretty upset about that. So Percy Shelley did the only sensible thing for a young man of the Regency era. He ran off with the then 16-year-old Mary Godwin and her stepsister, Claire Claremont. Sure, he was married, but such a trivial thing as marriage wasn't going to stop Percy Shelley, Regency-era F-boy, from following his, heart. Mary, Percy, and Claire traveled around Europe for a bit. They were constantly dodging Percy's creditors, reading nonstop, and writing with any energy they had left over at the end of the day. They were also pretty strong believers in the free love movement, which left Percy plenty of time to engage in his favorite pastime, which was getting busy with anyone that caught his fancy. Now, what caught Percy's fancy was just about anybody. Percy may have been with Mary, but the number of partners he entertained can only be guessed at. Claire certainly was one of them, and along with that, probably half of France and Italy. During this time, Mary, not yet Shelley, gave birth to a baby girl who she did not name. That baby died just a few weeks later. Mary was, of course, horribly depressed about the loss of her child, but about that time, Percy came into a small inheritance when his grandfather died, and they were off again to tramp about Europe, waxing poetically about philosophy and and breaking hearts wherever they went. Eventually, the trio ended up in Switzerland, and they spent the summer of 1816 at Lake Geneva in a rented villa. They also spent quite a bit of time with Lord Byron and his personal physician, John Polidori, at another villa that Byron had rented for the season. Byron was already physically, but most likely not romantically, involved with Claire. Mary was most likely pregnant again, and this strange little group found themselves bored and desperate for entertainment. But before we go any farther, the setting needs a little more description. At this point, Europe was barely patching itself back together after the Napoleonic Wars. The countryside that Mary and her party had been exploring was hardly the idyllic setting that we imagine. It was war-torn, towns had been devastated by artillery, and there were ruins everywhere. Also around this time, the government of Great Britain was under the dominion of the Prince Regent. That Prince Regent would eventually go on to become King George IV. King George III, from Hamilton, had abdicated power at that time because of his ongoing struggles with mental illness. So for some time, his son, the future King George IV, ruled as the Prince Regent. Now, King George III was a pious, virtuous man who stayed married to one woman without affairs and believed very strongly in setting a good example for the people of England, whereas the future King George IV was absolutely not that. He believed in science, which is great. He also believed in philanthropy of the arts, which was also fantastic. He also liked to keep a lot of mistresses and was a bit of a flamboyant partier. Because of that, the Regency era tended to reflect, at least in the youth of that time, that more flamboyant challenging of religious mores and acceptance of more philosophical freedoms that the Prince Regent himself had embraced. So a lot of people, especially the moneyed aristocracy of England, like Percy Shelley, like Lord Byron, they also embraced a lot of those philosophical mores, and they embraced a little bit of the anarchistic thought that Mary Godwin's father had espoused, and they also embraced a lot of the feminist theory that Mary Godwin's mother had written quite extensively about before she passed. There were also a lot of scientific advances over the last 200 years, and at about this time, London streets had been lit up with gaslight. Around this time, steam engines were becoming rather prominent around the world, so progress was moving forward scientifically. The final piece of this setting is the summer of 1816 itself. Due to the eruption of a volcano in Indonesia, most of the world's climate shifted drastically during the summer of 1816, which lent to a very wet and chilly summer of 1816 throughout Europe. So here are these bored, ferociously intelligent young people unable to indulge in their typical summer activities. You find Lord Byron bored out of his mind, sick to death of Claire, and really desperate for some entertainment. So he proposes to his friends that they tell some traditional Germanic ghost stories. And everybody has a story except for Mary, who is now calling herself Mrs. Shelley, even though they're not yet married. Remember, Percy is still married to his first wife. She doesn't have a story for the initial night of storytelling, but over the next night or two, she ends up having a nightmare, a dream of a young scientist who has stitched together a body from the remains of cadavers. And the story is so startling, according to her own recollection, that she couldn't stop writing until she had finished the story. When Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, was published anonymously in 1818, most people reading it assumed that Percy Shelley had been the one that wrote it. That's an allegation that Mary spent the rest of her life facing. He did write the foreword to the book, so a lot of people just assumed that the anonymous author was Percy Shelley. Regardless, the book was an instant success, which is pretty remarkable, being that the author was, at the point of publication, barely 21 years old. To a lot of people, that's the story of Mary Shelley. She wrote Frankenstein. She was married to Percy Shelley, who is considered now to be one of the most prominent poets of the Romantic era. But without Mary Shelley, we probably wouldn't know much about Percy. We'll get into that in just a minute. But tragedy was a constant fixture in Mary Shelley's life. Of her 5 pregnancies, only one of those children actually survived to adulthood. Most of them died while they were still quite young. Percy and Mary were both plagued with poor health, Percy most likely with tuberculosis. They traveled constantly to find a climate that agreed with Percy's constitution. This in itself may have contributed to the ill health of their children, as Mary believed, or it could have been, of course, from the absolute lack of hygiene of the era. Really, it feels like everybody on this story is just on the verge of keeling over dead. That tragedy wasn't just limited to the Shelleys either. Claire's child, by way of Byron, was abandoned by him to a monastery. He didn't really want Claire to be involved in the upbringing of the child, as he believed that any child raised by the Shelleys wasn't going to survive. He, of course, didn't want to raise the child either because he was far too young and far too Lord Byron to be burdened by such a thing, so he gave the child up to a monastery where she died pretty young because even monasteries were terrible, stinking cesspools of disease at the time. But Byron had another daughter. She was raised without his involvement. Her mother was so terrified that Ada would become a lackabout poet like her father that she raised Ada to love math. And of course, I'm talking about Ada Lovelace. She's regarded widely as one of the first ever computer programmers. She was so freaking smart that she created algorithms for machines that wouldn't even be created for another century. Take that, poets. The Shelleys went on to live around Europe, evading Percy's creditors, getting sick, and burying their babies. Then, in 1822, Percy Shelley died in a boating accident with a few friends. I like to think of this trip as Percy Shelley's Let's Impregnate Southern Europe farewell tour. But sure, that was really sad. There was one less contestant on Regency-era F-Boy Island. Byron and several other friends of the Shelleys cremated Percy's body on the shore of southern Italy because Percy was way too pretty to bury in England. Byron himself died just a few years later fighting for Greece against the Ottoman Empire. That just doesn't track with everything else I've read about Byron, but for some reason he decided to go off and be a folk hero. Mary was obviously devastated at the loss of her husband. They had not been getting along. She even at one point wrote that if she had been able to blot out the 5 years that they'd been together, perhaps she could look back on it fondly. I'm also sure that there was one part of her that realized her nearly 8-year-long streak of being pregnant or nursing a child that was doomed to perish had just come to an end. And lo and behold, Mary did have one child survive to adulthood. She took solace in raising her son, Percy Jr. They spent their time traveling, writing, and organizing Percy Sr.'s collected works. She published several more novels in her lifetime, including a book called The Last Man, which is about the sole earthly survivor of a plague that wiped out the human race. If that sounds a bit like Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, I'm sure there's a bit of a similarity, but his story was published over 100 years later. Still, between Frankenstein and The Last Man, Mary Shelley did a lot to popularize what we now call science fiction. Mary Shelley lived the remainder of her life traveling, writing, and generally enjoying her life in the company of her son before dying from a brain tumor in 1851. So she was only 53, 54 years old when she passed. After reading about the horrible hygiene and living conditions of that time, I'm sure she was considered an old lady by people of the era. Her son and her daughter-in-law spent a lot of time after Mary Shelley died trying to sanitize her image for pre-Victorian moral standards, but Mary Shelley's own journals survive, and they paint a pretty vivid picture of a fierce idealist, the product of two keen, vivid intellects who held some sway during the Age of Enlightenment. After her death, her son found one final grim surprise from his mother. Mary Shelley had kept some of Percy's ashes wrapped up in one of his poems. This was found in a box in her desk. And when Percy Jr. opened up that poem, he found the ashes as well as the remains of Percy Bysshe Shelley's heart. When I first read that, I had to replace Ozzy Osbourne as the single most metal person I'd ever heard about. Yes, Ozzy may have bit the head off a bat. That's still potentially an urban legend. But Mary Shelley kept her husband's heart in a drawer, and that's the single most metal thing I have ever heard of. I was a little confused at first, thinking that Mary had asked Byron or one of the other folks that had cremated her husband on the seashore to cut his heart out, but the real story is far more grim than that. As Percy's body was burning in his funeral pyre, they noticed that his heart would not ignite. So one of his friends took his heart out from the fire and preserved it in some alcohol and spirits. And it was later given to Mary, who wanted the heart for some reason or another. Researchers, doctors, and scientists now believe that the reason why Percy's heart did not catch on fire was because it had been calcified from his ongoing struggles with tuberculosis. There is so much more to Mary Shelley's story than I can do justice to in just this short video. She was an abolitionist, she was fiercely political, and she was way ahead of her time in her views on LGBTQ+ equality. If you'd like to learn more about Mary Shelley, I've added some affiliate links to a couple of fantastic biographies that have been written about her, and a link to this edition of Frankenstein, which has been illustrated by my personal hero, Bernie Wrightson. It's a fantastic book with some of the greatest illustrations you will ever set your eyes on. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Make sure to reanimate those like and subscribe buttons. We'll be back with more creepy cool content soon. Go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring.